Hey, my name is Lucas Grant. I'm 32 years old and I own a small auto repair shop on the north side of town. On paper, it's called Grant Auto, but calling it a business feels generous most days. Two bays, one lift that's been running since before I could vote, and Eddie, the only other guy who still shows up every morning. My father left the place to me 6 years ago. He didn't leave much money, just the name people in this neighborhood used to trust. He always said customers might not understand engines, but they'd remember for a long time if a mechanic tried to screw them. I've tried to keep that rule. I don't replace parts that still have life in them. I don't invent problems that don't exist. I don't charge more just because someone doesn't know what's under the hood. Being decent doesn't mean the work comes easy, though. A big chain opened a full-service center less than 3 miles away last year. They've got clean waiting rooms, free coffee, and an advertising budget I'll never touch. My bays have been quieter every month since. To keep the doors open, I mortgaged the house a second time. I've been 3 weeks late on Eddie's paycheck, and 2 suppliers are waiting on money I don't have. The bank sent the final notice last Tuesday. I've got maybe 4 weeks before they start the paperwork. That night, I drove to the little diner on the corner of Willow and 5th because the only things left in my fridge were mustard and half a loaf of stale bread. I took the table by the window, ordered the cheapest eggs on the menu, and pulled the bank statement out of my jacket to do the math again. The shop account had enough to last another month if nothing else broke. I was still staring at the numbers when a man's voice 2 tables over started getting louder. I didn't look up right away. Bad dates aren't my problem, and I already had enough of my own. But he kept talking like he wanted the whole room to hear. "None of your profile mentioned this," he said. I glanced over. The woman across from him looked about 30, maybe a little older. Dark hair pulled back, neat, simple but expensive navy blouse. She sat in a clean black wheelchair, hands resting on the napkin in her lap. Her face stayed calm, but her fingers had gone white from gripping the fabric. The man kept cutting his steak like he was the one who'd been insulted. "I drove 40 minutes to get here," he said. I thought this was a date, not charity work. 2 older women at the counter turned, then quickly looked away. A couple near the door pulled out their phones. Nobody was going to step in. They just wanted to record it. The woman said something too quiet for me to catch. Her voice sounded steady, which only made his next words land harder. "I'm just being honest," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You look fine from the waist up, but this is really what you expect a man to accept?" The waitress walked past their table with a tray and kept her eyes straight ahead. Even the cook behind the counter pretended to be busy. I told myself it wasn't my business. I was 3 weeks from losing the shop. I couldn't afford to get into it with some stranger and end up in jail or make my already shitty life worse. I put cash on the table, folded the bank statement, and stood up. I was actually going to walk out. Then he said one more thing. "Honestly, I don't understand why someone like you still bothers showing up to these things." I stopped. I wasn't angry the way you get when you want to throw a punch. My head just went quiet. The same quiet that comes over me when I'm staring at a stripped bolt and I know if I force it, I'll only make everything worse. I turned around, walked to their table, and rested my hand on the back of the empty chair. "Excuse me," I said. The man looked up, still wearing that small, superior smile. "Do we know each other?" he asked. "No." I kept my voice even. "I just wanted to know if you were finished talking." His smile faltered for half a second. "This is a private conversation." "It stopped being private about 10 minutes ago," I said. "Once you decided to say cruel shit loud enough for the whole room to hear, you don't get to call it private anymore." The diner had gone almost completely still. The man glanced around and saw what I already knew. Every person who had been pretending not to listen was now watching him. Even the couple with the phones had lowered them. He looked me over. Work clothes, grease under my nails, shoulders that come from lifting engines instead of sitting behind desks. Then he set his knife and fork down. "Fine," he said. "I don't need to sit here for this." He pulled out his wallet, tossed 2 20s on the table, and stood. The money didn't even cover their meals, but I guess he thought the gesture made him look less small. Before he walked away, he turned back toward the woman like he still had something else to say. I cut him off. "Don't!" He stared at me for a second, then left. The door shut behind him. I looked at the woman. Her eyes were wet, but no tears had fallen. She was holding herself together the way people do when they've had a lot of practice. "I'm sorry," I said. She studied me for a long moment. Are you apologizing for him? No, I'm apologizing because everyone heard and still left you sitting there alone. She kept looking at me like she was trying to decide whether I was being honest or just another man who wanted something. After a few seconds, she nodded toward the chair the man had just vacated. Sit down. I looked back at my own table. The coffee had gone cold. The eggs were still there, untouched. I sat anyway. The waitress brought me a fresh cup without being asked and set a glass of ice water in front of the woman. Her eyes said, sorry, but it was too late and we all knew it. When it was just the two of us, she asked, why did you step in? I didn't have a noble answer. I almost didn't. She raised an eyebrow. I told her the truth, that I'd already put money on the table and picked up my keys, that I was going to walk out just like everyone else, that I was tired and broke and had no business making my life any more complicated than it already was. But the last thing he said made it impossible for me to keep walking. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, tired and cruel aren't the same thing. I didn't know how to answer that. She told me her name was Naomi. I told her mine was Lucas. For the next 20 minutes, we talked like two strangers who had no reason to pretend. She asked what I did. I told her about the shop, about Eddie, about being 3 weeks behind on payroll. I don't know why I admitted that part. Maybe because she listened without looking sorry for me. She didn't say much about herself, just that she worked in investments and had been in a wheelchair since a car accident years ago. When it was time to leave, she took a plain white business card from the small bag attached to her chair and set it on the table. No company name, no title, just a phone number. I hope next week is better for you than this one was, she said. She paid both checks with a black card, then wheeled herself out. She didn't ask for my number. She didn't say she'd call. I sat there looking at the card and figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, a black sedan with no badges on it rolled into the lot of Grant Auto. It was the kind of car that didn't need to announce itself. Low, quiet, expensive. I was under a 98 F-150 when Eddie shouted from the bay door. Lucas, think you got company, important-looking company. I slid out on the creeper and wiped my hands on a rag that was already past saving. The driver got out first, a guy in a gray suit. He opened the trunk, pulled out a folded wheelchair, and set it beside the rear door. Then Naomi appeared. She moved from the back seat into the chair by herself, smooth and practiced, like she'd done it 1,000 times. The driver stayed back. She didn't need him. I stood up. Naomi. Lucas. She looked around the shop without saying anything. The cracked concrete, the old lift, the overdue invoices pinned to the board, the red final notice letter from the bank still sitting on my desk. She didn't comment on any of it. You never told me your last name, she said. You never asked. It's Grant. Lucas Grant. She nodded once. I'm Naomi Clark. The name landed heavier than I expected. Clark Hospital, Clark Research Center, the scholarships. I'd driven past the surgical wing every day for years and never once connected it to the woman in the wheelchair from the diner. I want to invest in your shop, she said. I laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. We talked for less than half an hour. I know. You don't know my revenue, my debts, or the condition of my equipment. I had someone check. That stopped me. The rag in my hands suddenly felt too small. She knew. She knew about the second mortgage on the house. She knew I was 3 weeks behind on Eddie's pay. She knew the bank notice was sitting in the top drawer of my desk. Everything I'd been trying to hold together by myself was now sitting between us like an open ledger. If you already know all that, I said, then you also know I can't pay you back anytime soon. I'm not offering you a loan. She wanted to buy a minority stake. I would keep full operational control. The money would clear the overdue bills, replace the lift, fix the building violations, and give us working capital. Simple on paper. Nothing simple about it in my head. Why me? I asked. She looked at me without blinking. I've met a lot of men who like to talk about character in nice offices. They wear it well, but they don't actually live it. I watched you stand up when nobody else in that diner would. I decided to put money on a person who does that when no one's forcing them to. I shook my head. That was one moment. It doesn't mean you know who I am. It's usually all we ever get. She gave me a week to think about it. I took 4 days. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing my father's voice telling me never to let someone with money own a piece of what he built. But I also kept seeing Eddie's face when I told him his check would be late again. He has a wife and 2 kids. I'd been asking him to wait 3 weeks already because I couldn't stomach the idea of someone else controlling the shop. On the morning of the 5th day, I called the number on the card. "I'll look at the contract," I said. "Just look." She sounded almost amused. "That's enough." Her 2 advisors showed up that afternoon. They went through the books, the equipment, the permits, every debt. I made it clear in writing that Naomi would own only a minority share and that every decision about pricing, hiring, and day-to-day operations stayed with me. She signed without arguing. 2 weeks later, a new sign went up outside. Still said Grant Auto, just cleaner and sturdier. 2 new lifts were on order. We had an actual accountant, a line of credit at a reasonable rate, and enough cash to pay Eddie what I owed him, plus the next 2 weeks in advance. The first money that came back to me went straight to the bank to catch up the house payment. I didn't tell Naomi. I kept waiting for the catch. For the first month, she didn't interfere. She came by every Friday afternoon, looked at the numbers, asked a few questions about progress, then left. One time she stayed almost an hour just watching me explain to an old lady why her transmission didn't actually need to be rebuilt, even though another shop had told her it did. When the lady left, Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You just turned down almost $4,000 in work." Because her car didn't need it. "You do realize that's exactly why your shop is in trouble, right?" I met her eyes. "If you wanted to invest in someone willing to lie to customers to make money, you picked the wrong place." She smiled, small and real. "I didn't say you should change." After that, the visits got easier. She was still blunt in a way that made me uncomfortable, and I still didn't know how to take help without feeling like I owed something. But I started to believe she actually wanted the shop to survive. Then the oldest supplier I had called and told me they were done extending 30-day terms. From now on, it was cash on delivery. When I asked why, the manager mumbled something about new policy and hung up. 2 days after that, a city inspector showed up without warning. He spent 90 minutes walking through the shop and wrote up every small code violation that had existed for years. Faded parking lines, a missing vent cover, an exit sign hung 2 inches too low. None of them were safety emergencies, but fixing them all at once would cost more than I had. I was starting to understand this wasn't random. That weekend, Naomi came in with her laptop on her lap and a colder expression than usual. She closed the office door behind her. "There's something I should have told you from the beginning," she said. The first sign something was wrong came from the supplier I'd used for 8 years. They called on a Tuesday and told me they were done with 30-day terms. From now on, it was cash on delivery. When I asked why, the manager got quiet and said something about new policy before hanging up. 2 days later, a city inspector showed up without an appointment. He walked through the shop for an hour and a half and wrote up every minor violation that had been there for years. Faded parking stripes, a missing vent screen, an exit sign that was 2 inches too low. None of them were dangerous, but fixing them all at once would cost more than I had in the account. I was standing in the office staring at the list when Naomi rolled in that Friday. She had her laptop on her lap, and her face was colder than I'd ever seen it. She closed the door behind her. "There's something I should have told you from the beginning," she said. The man behind everything was named Victor Hale. Hale owned 3 big dealerships and a chain of service centers across the region. On TV, he looked like a friendly local businessman who sponsored little league teams and charity events. In the trade, every small shop knew how he worked. He'd drop prices until the competition couldn't survive, then buy the struggling places cheap and raise rates once there was nowhere else to go. Naomi told me Hale had been a business partner of her father 15 years ago. They had a falling out over a big deal. Her father accused him of cooking the numbers and pulled out. No lawsuit ever happened, but Hale had been quietly going after anything connected to the Clark family ever since. For the last 2 years, he'd been quiet. Naomi thought he'd finally moved on. "The moment he found out I put money into Grant Auto, he started making calls," she said. "He doesn't care about your shop. He cares about proving that anything with my money attached to it can be destroyed." I sat on the edge of the workbench. "You knew he could do this." "I knew it was possible. I thought he had stopped." You should have told me. She didn't argue. You're right. The quick admission only made me angrier. I had agreed to take an investment, not step into a war between two rich families. She opened her laptop and showed me files her security team had put together over 6 months. Shell companies, invoices to a PR firm, proof that Hale had done the same thing to other projects connected to her family. I didn't understand all the financial diagrams, but I understood that Hale was very good at making coordinated attacks look like random bad luck. She said she wouldn't pull her money out. If she did, Hale would win. But she gave me a choice. If you want to end the partnership, I'll walk away clean. You keep the new lifts, the repairs we've already paid for, and the credit line. You don't owe me anything. I looked at her. Part of me wanted to say yes right then. If she left, maybe Hale would lose interest and I could go back to the way things were. But then I thought about the night in the diner. Naomi could have left that table too. She had the money to never set foot in a place like that again. But she stayed and took it until someone finally stepped in. I had walked over to her table because I didn't want to watch someone use their power to humiliate a person who couldn't fight back in that moment. If I walked away now just because the other side had more money, I would be denying the very thing that made Naomi trust me in the first place. If you're staying, I said, then I'm staying too. She studied me for a long second. You're sure? I stood up in that diner. I'll stand up for my shop. Things got worse faster than I expected. A local paper ran a story asking questions about the relationship between Grant Auto and outside investment from the Clark family. It never said anything outright illegal, but it kept using words like lack of transparency and quiet takeover. No one was quoted by name. The story still spread. Within a week, 3 regular customers canceled appointments. One man who had been bringing his trucks to me for almost 10 years came in person and said his wife had read the article and didn't want to do business with us anymore. I tried to explain that Naomi only owned a small stake and I still ran everything, but he didn't want to hear it. 2 more suppliers stopped taking our orders. Eddie asked me very carefully if he should start looking for another job. He tried to sound casual, but I could hear the fear underneath. I told him everything would be fine, even though I didn't believe it myself. Then the letter arrived from the city. The Small Business Review Board was holding a public hearing on our application to expand the shop. The expansion itself was just a routine permit, but a group calling themselves community stakeholders had asked for a full review. The person who filed the request was Victor Hale. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in my dark kitchen. The letter from the city was on the table next to the supplier cancellation notices and the list of customers who had pulled out. I hadn't told Naomi everything. Not because I didn't trust her, I just wasn't used to admitting I was scared. Saying it out loud felt like handing the people trying to destroy me another weapon. I wrote 3 different speeches and tore all of them up. I knew that no matter what I said tomorrow, the room would already have a story about me. A desperate mechanic who took money from a rich woman and sold out the shop his father built. The truth was more complicated than that, but nobody in that room was going to care. For the first time, I understood exactly how Naomi must have felt, sitting in that diner while everyone watched and did nothing. The next morning, I put on the only clean dress shirt I owned and drove to City Hall. The hearing room was already full. I recognized neighbors and old customers. None of them met my eyes. Victor Hale sat in the front row on the opposite side, wearing a dark blue suit and chatting easily with board members like they were old friends. When he saw me, he smiled and gave a polite nod. The gesture made my skin crawl more than any threat could have. Naomi arrived just before the meeting started. She took a seat at the end of my row. She only looked at me once. In that look, I saw that she was scared too. She was just better at hiding it. The board chair, Margaret Ellis, read the agenda in a tired voice. Hale was allowed to speak first. He never raised his voice. He talked about transparency and community interests and the danger of outside money taking over local businesses. Every time he mentioned me, he called me a respected local mechanic. Every time he mentioned Naomi, he used careful, polite language. That politeness made him more dangerous than if he had shouted. By the time he finished, the room felt like it already belonged to him. Then Margaret called my name. I walked to the wooden podium and put both hands on it so they wouldn't shake. In front of me were people who had known me for years but were now waiting to see if I was the man they'd read about in the paper. I had no speech left. so I told them the truth. The room was already full when I walked in. I saw faces I'd known for years. Neighbors, customers who used to wave when they drove past the shop. None of them looked at me for more than a second. Victor Hale sat in the front row on the opposite side, wearing a dark blue suit and talking easily with two of the board members like they played golf together every weekend. When he noticed me, he gave a small, polite smile and nodded. That smile made my stomach turn more than any threat could have. Naomi arrived a minute before the meeting started. She took the empty seat at the end of my row. She only glanced at me once. In that look, I saw she was scared too. She just hid it better. Margaret Ellis, the board chair, read the agenda in a flat, tired voice. Hale was invited to speak first. He never raised his voice. He talked about transparency and protecting local businesses from outside money. He called me a respected local mechanic every time he mentioned my name. He never once attacked Naomi directly, but every careful sentence made it sound like I had sold out my father's shop to a rich woman from out of town. By the time he finished, the room felt like it had already decided I was guilty. Then Margaret called my name. I walked to the wooden podium and put both hands on it so they wouldn't shake. In front of me were people who had known me for 16 years but were now waiting to see if I matched the story they'd read in the newspaper. I had 3 different speeches in my pocket. I didn't use any of them. "I'm not going to read something I wrote last night," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I'm going to tell you the truth because that's the only thing I have that Mr. Hale doesn't." The room went very quiet. I told them that 6 weeks ago I had eaten dinner alone at the diner on Willow and Fifth. I told them my checking account had $42 in it that night. I told them I was 3 weeks behind on my employee's paycheck and that the final notice from the bank was sitting in the glove box of my truck. I said it because Hale had made everyone in this room wonder why a man like me would take money from Naomi Clark. They had a right to know the answer. I told them about the man at the next table who spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I told them the things he said to the woman in the wheelchair. I told them I had already put money on my table and picked up my keys. I admitted I was about to walk out just like everyone else in that room. "I'm not a hero," I said, looking around at the faces watching me. "I'm a tired mechanic who's been trying to keep his shop open." But the last thing that man said made it impossible for me to keep walking. I told them I sat with Naomi for 20 minutes. I told them she came to the shop 3 days later and offered to invest. I told them I thought there had to be a catch. I told them the investment had now cost me customers I'd had for 10 years, suppliers I'd worked with since my father was alive, and this hearing room. I looked straight at Naomi. She said she was investing in what people do when nobody's forcing them to do the right thing. Then I turned to Hale. "Mr. Hale has done an excellent job of making this partnership look like something it isn't. I understand why some of you believe him. He's very good at telling stories." The polite smile on Hale's face disappeared. I kept going. I told them how I ran the shop the way my father taught me. No fake repairs, no charging women more than men, no tearing a car apart looking for problems that didn't exist. I said I was willing to open every book and swear to it under oath if that's what they needed. When I walked back to my seat, my hands were shaking so hard I had to sit on them. Naomi asked to speak next. She didn't go to the podium. She opened her laptop right there on her lap and read the investment agreement out loud, line by line. The amount was much smaller than the newspaper had implied. She owned only a minority stake. Every decision about pricing, hiring, and operations belonged to me. She gave the board the name of the accounting firm that had reviewed everything and offered to send the full records that same day. I thought that was the end of it. Then she opened another folder. She said her team had traced the money that paid for the newspaper article questioning my shop. It went through a shell company to a PR firm. 2 layers down, the final source was Hale Automotive Group. She read the invoice numbers and the dates. She named the 2 anonymous sources quoted in the article, both former Hale employees who had received large consulting payments the same week the story ran. She didn't call Hale a liar. She didn't have to. Then she announced that she had filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office for coordinated interference with a licensed business. Hale turned to his lawyer. The lawyer wouldn't meet his eyes. Margaret Ellis called for a recess. 20 minutes later, the board returned. The vote to approve the expansion of Grant Auto was 6-1. The room emptied in awkward silence. A few people who used to be regular customers looked at me but didn't know what to say. Hale and his lawyer left through a side door. I stayed in my seat until the room was almost empty. Naomi wheeled down the aisle and stopped beside me. "When did you get that file?" I asked. "About a week ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at me without flinching. "Because I wanted to hear what you would say first." I didn't understand. "If you had read a speech full of numbers," she said, "I still would have shown the evidence and we would have won on paper. But you told the truth. So we didn't just win the vote, we made the whole room understand what actually happened." I didn't know whether to feel grateful or angry that she had gambled my shop on whether I would say the right thing. "You bet my garage on me saying what you wanted to hear." She shook her head. "No, I bet on you being who you are." That answer left me with nothing to say. For years I had treated carrying everything alone like it was strength. Naomi had seen both the stubbornness and the fear underneath it. She had still chosen to stand beside me even when she couldn't be sure I would turn out to be the man she hoped I was. "If I had said the wrong thing," I asked quietly, "I still would have shown the evidence," she said. "I wasn't going to let Hale destroy you just to prove he was right about me." That was the moment I finally understood she hadn't invested in me to get something back. She had bet on me even when she had no guarantee I would become the person she believed I could be. We left City Hall together. Outside, 2 reporters were waiting. I started to step aside so Naomi could handle it, but she stopped. "Grant Auto belongs to Lucas," she said. "Ask him." I looked at the microphones and remembered the hearing room I had just walked out of. This time, I didn't step back. 3 weeks after the hearing, the state investigation into Hale Automotive Group was made public. 2 of his dealerships received subpoenas. The board of his company asked him to step aside temporarily while the investigation continued. The newspaper that had run the story about me published a correction admitting the article had relied on sources with undisclosed conflicts of interest. I read the correction sitting in the small office at the shop. I didn't feel triumphant. The feeling was quieter than that. For the first time in months, I knew that other people couldn't just write whatever story they wanted about me without being challenged. Customers started coming back. Not all of them. Some simply pulled into the lot, handed over their keys, and talked about their cars like nothing had ever happened. At first, it made me angry. Then Eddie reminded me that a shop can't survive on pride alone. I still fixed their cars, but I no longer assumed loyalty was automatic. The suppliers who had cut us off began calling again. I didn't go back to the old terms. With Naomi's help, I built relationships with several different vendors, so no single company could hold the shop hostage again. We added a 3rd bay. I hired 2 young technicians straight out of the local trade school. One of them was partially deaf. I didn't hire him out of pity. He could diagnose engine problems by vibration better than most experienced techs could with their ears. Naomi still came every Friday. The visits stopped being only about numbers. She would stay after we closed, sometimes eating takeout on the workbench between stacks of invoices and parts boxes. I learned more about her. She had been 26 when the car accident happened. A drunk driver ran a red light and damaged her spine. The doctor said she would probably never walk again. Her fiancé at the time slowly pulled away and eventually left, saying he couldn't handle a life that no longer matched the plan they had made. She didn't tell the story with bitterness, but I heard what she didn't say. After that, she had gotten used to waiting for people to leave. One night, I told her why the shop mattered so much to me. It wasn't just because it had belonged to my father. After he died, I had the chance to sell the land for more than the business was worth. Selling would have meant admitting that everything he built could be replaced by a parking lot for a chain store. I had mortgaged the house and worked myself into the ground to keep it instead. Naomi listened, then said, "You're not just protecting a building, you're trying to protect the memory of your father." Is that wrong? No, but sometimes we turn memory into a cage and call it loyalty. The words stung because they were true. I had kept the shop exactly the way my father ran it, refusing to change even when the world around it had changed. I had treated every offer of help like an insult and nearly lost Eddie in the process. After that conversation, I stopped treating growth like betrayal. We added electric vehicle diagnostics, built an online scheduling system, and started taking on apprentices who couldn't afford their own tools. One evening, almost a year after the hearing, Naomi came to the shop after closing. She wasn't wearing her usual work clothes, just a gray sweater. On her lap was a paper bag from the diner on Willow and Fifth. "I thought we should eat dinner where the story started," she said. I looked at the bag. "I'm not sure the eggs there are worth traveling for." She laughed. It was the first time she had called herself "we" when talking about the two of us. We sat on the floor near the open bay door and watched headlights pass on the road outside. She asked if I ever regretted standing up in the diner that night. I thought about it for a long time. If I had kept walking that night, the shop would probably have closed. I wouldn't have been targeted by hail. I wouldn't have lost customers or had to stand in front of the whole town and admit how close I was to losing everything. But I also would have kept living the way I had been, carrying everything alone, suspicious of every hand that reached out, shrinking my life until nothing could hurt me anymore. "I don't regret it," I said. "Not because the shop got saved." She turned to look at me. "I don't regret it because I met someone who never tried to turn me into a charity project, even when I assumed that's what she was doing." Naomi lowered her head for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. "And I met someone who saw me instead of the wheelchair." I reached toward her, then stopped halfway. I had never once moved her chair or touched her without asking. I knew that care could become control if you weren't careful. She looked at my hand, then placed hers in it. We didn't make any big promises that night. Neither of us pretended the differences between us would disappear. She was a woman with enough money to change the whole neighborhood. I was still a mechanic with grease under my fingernails. But from that evening on, what existed between us was no longer just investor and shop owner. A year later, we held an open house for the community. The old sign my father had hung was still inside the office, but outside was a newer, brighter one. Grant Auto now had 4 bays, 5 employees, and a waiting list almost 3 weeks long. Eddie had been made shop manager and was finally being paid what he deserved. In the middle of the afternoon, I saw the 2 older women who had been sitting at the counter the night everything started. They came in for an oil change and looked uncomfortable when they recognized me. One of them said, "We should have said something that night." I didn't comfort them by saying it didn't matter. "Yeah," I answered. "You should have." They looked down. I added, "But there's still time to do it differently next time." After everyone had gone, Naomi stopped in front of the new sign. She asked if I still remembered the first night. I did. I remembered the cold coffee, the bank statement in my pocket, and how close I had come to walking out of that diner. I also remembered her sitting perfectly straight while a man tried to turn her disability into a reason to humiliate her. I had once thought the decision to stand up lasted about 60 seconds. It had actually changed everything that came after. Not because I saved her. She had never needed saving. I had simply stood beside her at a moment when everyone else chose to look away. And when Hale came after the shop, she did the same for me. She didn't buy his silence or hide the problem with money. She stood beside me, brought the truth into the light, and let me tell my own story. That night, before I locked the doors, I looked up at the name on the sign. Grant. It was still there. Not because I had carried everything alone. It was still there because I had finally learned that accepting a hand offered in good faith didn't mean handing over ownership of my life. Sometimes it just means 2 people helping each other stay standing. And it all began on a night I had almost chosen to walk out the door.